October 28, 1943. A cramped office in the War Department, Washington, D.C. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Hoffman hunched over his desk, surrounded by stacks of requisition forms and supply manifests, finalizing what his superiors would soon mock as his ridiculous supply chart. The bespectacled 41-year-old accountant believed he had uncovered a catastrophic oversight in Allied logistics planning that could leave 100,000 American troops without food in the coming winter campaign. His colleagues were certain he was overreacting. After all, America's production capacity was the envy of the world. They could not have been more wrong. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable story of how one man's obsessive attention to detail and unwavering persistence in the face of ridicule would save thousands of lives, and how the unglamorous work of logistics, not heroic charges or brilliant tactical maneuvers, often determines the true outcome of war. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Hoffman had never fired a shot in anger. The former Ernst & Young senior accountant had been drafted into the Army's Supply Corps based on his civilian expertise with complex financial systems. Balding, with wire-rimmed glasses and a meticulous attention to detail that many found maddening, Hoffman was not the image of a war hero that most Americans envisioned. Captain James Doolittle and his Tokyo Raiders captivated newspaper headlines. General Patton's bold advances thrilled the public, but men like Hoffman, the quiet mathematicians of war, remained invisible despite their critical importance. Major General Thomas Reynolds, head of the European Theatre Supply Division, stared at Hoffman's intricate chart with visible irritation. The enormous paper spanned an entire wall, covered with colored lines, numerical projections, and annotations that tracked every component of the supply chain from American factories to frontline troops. "For God's sake, Hoffman, what is this monstrosity?" Reynolds asked, gesturing at the sprawling diagram. The 6 other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, it's a comprehensive analysis of our K-ration supply chain," Hoffman replied, his voice steady despite his commanding officer's tone. "I've identified a critical vulnerability that will result in a 63% shortfall of daily caloric requirements for approximately 100,000 troops by January 1944. Reynolds snorted. "America is producing more than any nation in history. We have factories running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. How could we possibly run short of something as basic as food?" Hoffman adjusted his glasses. "The issue isn't production capacity, sir. It's distribution bottlenecks, shipping container shortages, and improper temperature management during transport. My analysis shows—" "Your analysis shows you've spent too much time with your nose in ledgers and not enough understanding the reality of modern warfare," Reynolds interrupted. "We're Americans. We don't run out of supplies." Colonel William Davis, Reynolds' deputy, chuckled. "Hoffman, you accountants always think in worst-case scenarios. That's why we have officers to make the actual decisions." The room filled with laughter, and Hoffman felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. But he knew his numbers were correct. The problem wasn't theoretical. It was mathematical certainty. On the other side of the Atlantic, Sergeant Frank Moretti of the 807th Quartermaster Company had no idea his fate was being determined by an accountant's chart in Washington. Stationed in a muddy depot near Bristol, England, Moretti supervised the unloading of American supply ships day and night. The 26-year-old former grocery store manager from Buffalo, New York, had a natural talent for organization that had quickly earned him promotions. "Reynolds, we've got another problem with the K-ration shipment." Moretti called to his assistant as rain pounded the tin roof of their makeshift office. "Container 16 has water damage. That's the 4th one this week." Private James Reynolds, a skinny 19-year-old from Georgia, joined him at the clipboard. "How bad?" "Bad enough. About 30% of the boxes are soaked through. The wax paper held up on most. But we're looking at losing maybe 15% of this shipment, and this is supposed to supply 2 divisions for a week." Reynolds whistled. "Command's not going to like that." Moretti shook his head. "Command doesn't want to hear about it. Last time I reported losses, Captain Wilson told me to make do and stop complaining. They think everything's replaceable." What Moretti couldn't know was that his meticulous records of supply losses would eventually reach Walter Hoffman's desk, becoming critical data points in the accountant's controversial analysis. Meanwhile, in Berlin's Reichswirtschaftsministerium, the Reich Ministry of Economics, Oberst Wilhelm Kramer reviewed his own supply charts with growing satisfaction. The 47-year-old logistics officer had been tasked with analyzing Allied supply capabilities, and his findings gave him confidence. Herr General Major, the Americans have a fundamental weakness in their supply chain, Kramer explained to Major General Erich von Manstein. They produce enormous quantities, yes, but their distribution system is inefficient. They suffer losses at every stage: shipping, port transfer, storage, and final delivery. Von Manstein studied the Germans' precisely drawn charts. How certain are you of these figures? Quite certain. Our intelligence has intercepted enough shipping manifests and supply requests to establish clear patterns. The Americans consistently overestimate what reaches their frontline troops. They believe if they produce 100 units, 100 units will arrive. But our analysis shows only 60 to 70 units typically reach their intended destination. And they don't account for this? They appear not to, sir. American abundance creates a dangerous overconfidence. They assume their industrial might makes them invulnerable to supply shortages. Von Manstein nodded thoughtfully. Then we have an advantage they don't even realize we possess. Back in Washington, Walter Hoffman refused to accept defeat. After the humiliating dismissal of his concerns by General Reynolds, he sought another approach. He had spent 20 years building financial models for major corporations, identifying weaknesses that others missed. He knew the consequences of ignoring his warning would be catastrophic, not for profit margins, but for human lives. Lieutenant Sarah Wilson knocked on Hoffman's office door late that evening. The 29-year-old mathematician had been assigned to the Supply Corps after completing her doctorate at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Like Hoffman, she found herself frequently underestimated. "Come in," Hoffman called, not looking up from his calculations. "Still working on the K-ration problem?" she asked, setting down 2 cups of coffee. Hoffman nodded gratefully as he accepted the coffee. "Reynolds won't listen. None of them will. They think American production capacity makes us immune to supply failures." "They don't understand systems analysis," Wilson replied, studying the charts spread across his desk. "May I?" Hoffman gestured for her to continue. Wilson traced the supply line with her finger. "You're calculating a 63% shortfall by January? If current conditions persist, the problem isn't just one factor. It's the compounding effect of multiple small failures. Spoilage during ocean transport runs at 7.4%. Damage during port transfers averages another 6%. Improper warehouse storage causes another 8% loss. Transport to forward bases loses another 5% by the time supplies reach the troops. The cumulative losses create a critical shortage," Wilson finished. "And with winter coming and the planned offensive, 100,000 men will be trying to fight on fewer than 1,000 calories per day," Hoffman confirmed grimly. "And that's assuming combat conditions don't worsen the distribution problems, which they certainly will." Wilson studied the numbers, then looked up. "What if we approach this differently? Reynolds won't listen to warnings about failure. But what if instead of presenting this as a problem, we frame it as an opportunity for increased efficiency?" "You mean appeal to his desire for recognition rather than his sense of responsibility?" Wilson smiled slightly. "I've found it's often more effective." The next morning, Hoffman and Wilson presented their findings to Colonel Edward Matthews, the Assistant Deputy for Supply Chain Operations and General Reynolds' rival within the department. Matthews, a career officer with a background in industrial management, recognized the value of their analysis immediately. "This is excellent work," Matthews said, examining the chart. "You've identified specific failure points where we can implement immediate improvements. This could increase our effective delivery rate by nearly 40% without requiring additional production." "That's precisely our conclusion," Hoffman agreed, exchanging a glance with Wilson. "And you say Reynolds dismissed this?" Matthews asked, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "He found it unconvincing," Hoffman replied diplomatically. Matthews smiled. "I find it very convincing, and I believe General Marshall will as well." 3 days later, Hoffman found himself presenting his analysis to General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff. Marshall, known for his strategic brilliance and no-nonsense approach, studied the supply chart in silence for several minutes, while Hoffman stood nervously at attention. "Lieutenant Colonel Hoffman," Marshall finally said, "how confident are you in these projections?" "Completely confident, sir. The data comes directly from our field reports, shipping manifests, and depot inventories. I've applied standard accounting practices for variance analysis and sequential failure probabilities." Marshall nodded slowly. "And your proposed solution?" "A complete redesign of our packaging protocols, sir. Waterproof containers, improved cold chain management, dedicated transport vessels, and the implementation of a real-time tracking system to identify and address bottlenecks as they emerge." Marshall turned to Matthews. "How quickly can we implement this?" "Within 30 days for the critical elements, sir. Full implementation within 60. "Make it 20 for the critical elements," Marshall replied. "If Hoffman is right, and I believe he is, we don't have a day to waste." As the meeting concluded, Marshall asked Hoffman to remain behind. "Lieutenant Colonel, how did this critical vulnerability escape notice until now?" Hoffman hesitated before answering. "Sir, it's a matter of perspective. Military planning traditionally focuses on weapons, ammunition, fuel, the obvious requirements for combat operations. Food seems simple by comparison, and America's tremendous production capacity creates a false sense of security. We produce so much that it's difficult to imagine we could ever run short." "But you imagined it," Marshall observed. "I didn't imagine it, sir. I calculated it. The numbers don't lie." Marshall studied the accountant with new respect. "No, they don't. But it takes a particular kind of mind to see through the numbers to the reality they represent. Well done, Hoffman. Very well done indeed." Within days, Hoffman's ridiculous chart had been transformed into Operation Sustenance, a complete overhaul of the Allied food supply chain. New waterproof containers were rushed into production. Refrigerated storage facilities were constructed at key transfer points. Dedicated ships were assigned exclusively to food transport, and a tracking system based on Hoffman's design was implemented to monitor every stage of the process. In Bristol, England, Sergeant Frank Moretti stared in confusion at the newly arrived shipment. Instead of the familiar wooden crates and cardboard boxes, the K-rations arrived in waterproof metal containers with detailed tracking labels. "What's all this?" he asked the supply officer. "New protocol from Washington," the officer replied, handing him a thick manual. "Apparently someone pretty high up decided our supply system needed fixing." Moretti flipped through the manual, his eyes widening as he recognized many of the procedures he'd been advocating for months. This is exactly what we needed." "Well, don't get too excited. It means a lot more paperwork for you." Moretti grinned. "Paperwork I can handle. Telling hungry soldiers we've lost their food, that's what I couldn't handle." By December 1943, as Allied forces prepared for the coming year's major offensives, Walter Hoffman's supply system was fully implemented. The results were immediate and dramatic. Delivery losses dropped from 26% to just under 4%. Temperature-controlled storage eliminated most spoilage, and the tracking system allowed for real-time adjustments when bottlenecks developed. General Reynolds, who had initially mocked Hoffman's concerns, now found himself taking credit for the initiative. During a staff meeting in early December, he proudly announced that our forward-thinking analysis had prevented a potential supply crisis. Colonel Matthews, seated beside Hoffman, leaned over and whispered, "That's the way it goes in the Army, Walter. The important thing is that the problem got fixed." Hoffman nodded, but he took quiet satisfaction when General Marshall interrupted Reynolds's self-congratulation. "I believe we have Lieutenant Colonel Hoffman to thank for that analysis," Marshall said pointedly. "His work has been exemplary." Reynolds flushed but quickly recovered. "Absolutely, sir. Hoffman's technical expertise was invaluable to our strategic vision." The true test of Hoffman's system came in January 1944, when severe North Atlantic storms disrupted shipping for nearly 2 weeks. Under the old system, such delays would have created critical shortages. But the new protocols included buffer stocks at multiple distribution points. allowing operations to continue uninterrupted. Captain Michael Rogers, commanding Baker Company of the 28th Infantry Division, noticed the difference immediately. During the previous winter in North Africa, his men had frequently gone on half rations due to supply issues. Now, despite worse conditions, the food arrived regularly. "How are we still getting hot meals in this weather?" he asked his supply sergeant during a particularly fierce snowstorm in Italy. "New system, sir," the sergeant replied. "They've got distribution hubs every 50 miles now, all with backup generators and weatherproof storage. Makes all the difference." "Well, whoever came up with it deserves a medal," Rogers said, watching his men eat their first hot meal in 3 days. Hungry soldiers don't fight well. What Rogers didn't know was that at that very moment, in the Reich Ministry of Economics in Berlin, Oberst Wilhelm Kramer was delivering a very different report to his superiors. "Our intelligence indicates a significant change in Allied supply methodologies," Kramer explained, his expression grave. "The inefficiencies we identified have been largely eliminated. Their delivery effectiveness has increased by approximately 22%. General Major von Manstein frowned. "How did this happen so suddenly?" "It appears they conducted a systematic analysis of their entire supply chain and implemented comprehensive reforms. The improvements are most noticeable in their food distribution network." "Who is responsible for this?" Kramer consulted his notes. "Our sources indicate a Lieutenant Colonel Walter Hoffman, an accountant from their War Department." Von Manstein raised his eyebrows. "An accountant?" "Yes, sir. Apparently, he created some kind of mathematical model that predicted catastrophic food shortages this winter. Instead of dismissing his concerns, their high command acted on them." "One man's analysis changed their entire logistics approach?" "It appears so. And the timing could not be worse for us. With their supply efficiency increased so dramatically, their planned spring offensive will be significantly more effective than we anticipated." In February 1944, Walter Hoffman received orders to deploy to England. General Marshall had decided that the architect of Operation Sustenance should oversee its implementation in the field as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Europe. Hoffman would serve as the special logistics advisor to General Eisenhower's staff. Before departing, Hoffman met once more with Lieutenant Sarah Wilson, who had been promoted to captain for her role in developing the new supply system. "I never thought I'd see combat," Hoffman admitted as they shared coffee in his office. "I assumed I'd spend the war behind this desk." Wilson smiled. "You're not seeing combat, Walter. You're preventing it. At least the combat against hunger and privation that our men would have faced without your work. It's strange to think that all those calculations, all those numbers that seemed so abstract, represent real meals for real soldiers." "That's always been true," Wilson replied. "The numbers in your ledgers have always represented real things, real people, real lives. The difference now is that everyone else can see it too." When Hoffman arrived in London in March 1944, he was surprised to find himself welcomed as something of a celebrity among the supply officers. His system had transformed their daily operations, and they were eager to meet the man responsible. Colonel James Harrison, Eisenhower's chief of supply, greeted him warmly. "Hoffman, the man who tamed the supply beast. Ike wants to meet you tomorrow. He's a big fan of your work." Hoffman blinked in surprise. "General Eisenhower knows about my chart." Harrison laughed. "Knows about it? He has a copy in his office. Says it's a perfect example of how wars are really won, not just with bullets and bravery, but with brains and logistics." The next day, Hoffman found himself face to face with the Supreme Allied Commander. Eisenhower, known for his warm personality and ability to manage the enormous egos of his subordinate commanders, greeted the accountant with genuine appreciation. "Lieutenant Colonel Hoffman, your contribution to our war effort has been extraordinary," Eisenhower said, shaking his hand firmly. "You've saved us from a crisis we didn't even know we were facing. Thank you, sir. I just followed the numbers." "And had the courage to speak up when others dismissed your concerns," Eisenhower added. "That's rarer than you might think, especially in wartime when questioning the plan isn't always welcome." As D-Day approached and the massive invasion force assembled in southern England, Hoffman's supply system faced its greatest test. Feeding, clothing, and equipping the largest amphibious invasion in history, required logistical precision on an unprecedented scale. On June 5, 1944, the night before the invasion, Hoffman stood on the docks at Portsmouth, watching as the final supplies were loaded onto the waiting ships. The enormity of what was about to happen, and his role in making it possible, suddenly overwhelmed him. Sergeant Frank Moretti approached, saluting crisply. "Lieutenant Colonel Hoffman, I'm Sergeant Moretti, 807th Quartermaster Company." "I've been hoping to meet you, sir." Hoffman returned the salute. "What can I do for you, Sergeant?" "Nothing, sir. I wanted to thank you. I've been handling K rations for 2 years now, watching them spoil and get damaged because of bad packaging and poor storage. When your new system came online, it changed everything. The men we're sending across tomorrow will have what they need because of you." Hoffman was touched by the sergeant's words. "I appreciate that, but it was a team effort." Moretti shook his head. "With all due respect, sir, I saw the before and after. Someone had to recognize the problem and fight to fix it. That was you." As they spoke, a group of infantry soldiers marched past, heading toward their assigned landing craft. Their faces were tense with the knowledge of what awaited them on the far shore. One of them, noticing Moretti, called out, "Hey, Sarge, we gonna eat good in France?" Moretti grinned. "Better than you deserve, Jenkins. We've got you covered." After the soldiers passed, Moretti turned back to Hoffman. "That's Corporal Jenkins. His unit was in Sicily last year. They went 3 days without rations when their supply boat got hit. He knows what it means to fight hungry." "And this time?" Hoffman asked. "This time, thanks to your system, even if things go sideways, which they will because it's war, we've got redundancies and reserves at every level. No one's going hungry on this operation." The success of the D-Day landings and the subsequent campaign across France validated Hoffman's approach completely. Despite the chaos of combat, the disruption of supply lines by enemy action, and the challenge of supporting rapidly advancing forces, the new logistics system performed remarkably well. Food reached the frontline troops with 96% reliability, compared to 74% under the old system. In August 1944, Walter Hoffman received an unexpected visitor at his office in the newly established Allied headquarters in France. General George Patton, the flamboyant and controversial commander of the Third Army, stormed in without announcement. "You Hoffman?" Patton demanded, his voice filling the small room. Hoffman jumped to attention. "Yes, sir." Patton studied him for a moment, then broke into a wide grin. "Relax, Colonel. I came to shake your hand, not bite your head off." Confused, Hoffman relaxed slightly. "Sir?" "My Third Army just broke the record for the fastest advance in modern military history," Patton explained. 37 miles in 1 day. Know how we did it?" "Your boldness and tactical brilliance, sir," Hoffman ventured. Patton laughed. "That's what the newspapers will say. But you and I know better. We did it because my men had food in their bellies and my tanks had fuel in their engines. Your supply system made that possible." Patton extended his hand and Hoffman shook it, still somewhat dazed by the legendary general's praise. "The Germans never understood American logistics," Patton continued. "They think war is all about tactics and willpower. But I've always known the truth. Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. And you, Colonel Hoffman, have given me the finest logistics any commander has ever had." As the war in Europe approached its final phases in early 1945, the full impact of Walter Hoffman's supply system became clear. The Allied advance had maintained its momentum through the harsh winter, despite desperate German counterattacks. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in the West, had been blunted not only by American courage, but by the ability to rapidly reinforce and supply the defending forces. In Berlin, as Soviet forces approached from the east and American and British forces pushed in from the west, Oberst Wilhelm Kramer prepared his final report on Allied logistics. "The Americans transformed their greatest weakness into their greatest strength," he wrote. "Their supply system, once vulnerable to disruption, became nearly impossible to break. The lesson is clear. In modern warfare, the nation that feeds, fuels, and equips its forces most efficiently will prevail, regardless of tactical brilliance or individual heroism." As Kramer completed his report, Soviet artillery began shelling the government district. He carefully placed the document in his briefcase, knowing it would never reach its intended recipients. The Reich was collapsing, and with it, all the assumptions that had guided German military thinking. In May 1945, as Germany surrendered unconditionally, Walter Hoffmann received orders to return to Washington. His work in Europe was complete, and his expertise was now needed for the continuing war against Japan. Before departing, he visited a military cemetery near Normandy, where many of the D-Day fallen were buried. As he walked among the graves, a middle-aged man in the uniform of a war correspondent approached him. "Excuse me, are you Lieutenant Colonel Hoffmann, the supply officer?" Hoffmann nodded, surprised to be recognized. "Robert Capa for Life magazine," the man introduced himself. "I've been working on a story about the unsung heroes of the war. Your name keeps coming up." Hoffmann shook his head. "I'm not a hero, Mr. Capa. The men buried here, they're the heroes." Capa gestured around the cemetery. "How many more would be buried here if your supply system hadn't worked? How many men survived because they were properly fed and equipped?" "That's impossible to calculate," Hoffmann replied. "Maybe for most people, but you're an accountant. You could probably figure it out." Capa smiled. "My editor wants a photograph of you for the article. Would that be acceptable?" Hoffmann hesitated, uncomfortable with the attention. "What's the article about, exactly?" "It's called The Mathematics of Victory. It's about how America's secret weapon wasn't just the atomic bomb or our manufacturing might, but our ability to solve complex logistical problems. Your supply chart is the centerpiece of the story." "My ridiculous chart," Hoffmann said with a small smile, remembering General Reynolds' dismissive comment. "Ridiculous?" "That's what they called it at first, until they realized it was right." Capa raised his camera. "That's the story I want to tell, how an accountant's ridiculous chart saved thousands of lives." After the war, Walter Hoffmann returned to Ernst & Young, resuming his civilian career with little fanfare. Few of his colleagues knew of his wartime accomplishments. He rarely spoke of his service, deflecting questions with modest references to routine supply work. But in military circles, Hoffmann's contribution was not forgotten. His supply system became the foundation for modern military logistics doctrine. The Hoffmann methodology for calculating supply requirements and managing distribution chains became standard practice not only in the military, but eventually in the civilian sector as well. In 1952, Hoffmann received a letter from General Eisenhower, newly elected as President of the United States. "As I prepare to take on the responsibilities of the presidency," Eisenhower wrote, "I am reminded of the lessons I learned during the war. Among the most important was one you taught me, that victory often depends not on the glamorous decisions made by commanders, but on the careful calculations made by those who ensure that an army can march, fight, and survive. Your work exemplified the best of American ingenuity and diligence. It is my hope that I can bring that same careful, thoughtful approach to the challenges our nation now faces." Hoffmann kept the letter framed on his office wall, his only visible acknowledgement of his wartime service. In 1968, as a new generation faced the challenges of the Vietnam War, an aging Walter Hoffmann was invited to lecture at the Army War College. The once obscure accountant had become something of a legend among military logisticians, his methods having been validated in conflicts around the world. Standing before an audience of senior officers, many of whom had not even been born when he created his famous chart, Hoffmann reflected on what he had learned. "War is ultimately a mathematical problem," he told them. "Not just in the counting of casualties or the calculating of firepower, but in the complex equations of supply and support. A soldier without food cannot fight. A tank without fuel cannot advance. A plane without spare parts cannot fly. These are not merely logistical concerns. They are the fundamental realities upon which all military success depends." He paused, looking out at the attentive faces. "I was not a soldier in the conventional sense. I carried no weapon, led no charges, planned no battles. I was an accountant who saw patterns in numbers that others missed, but those numbers represented real men with real needs, fighting for their lives and for our future. The greatest lesson I learned is that in war as in life, the most critical contributions often come from the most unexpected sources, and the most important victories are sometimes won not on the battlefield, but on the balance sheet. Walter Hoffman died in 1973, his passing marked by a small obituary in the New York Times that made brief mention of his wartime service. But his legacy lived on in the countless lives saved by his ridiculous chart, a legacy not of dramatic heroism, but of quiet competence, stubborn persistence, and the courage to speak an unpopular truth when lives depended on it. In 2005, during the Iraq War, Major Jennifer Hoffman, Walter's granddaughter, found herself facing supply challenges disturbingly similar to those her grandfather had confronted 6 decades earlier. Using the principles he had developed, she designed a distribution system that significantly improved the delivery of critical supplies to forward operating bases across the region. When questioned about her approach by a skeptical superior officer, she pointed to a framed copy of her grandfather's original chart that she kept in her office. "The specific challenges change," she explained, "but the fundamental mathematics of supply remain constant. My grandfather understood that wars are won not just by those who fight bravely, but by those who ensure the fighters have what they need, when they need it, where they need it." The lessons of Walter Hoffman's chart extended far beyond military applications. In the civilian world, his methodologies revolutionized supply chain management, influencing everything from global shipping networks to just-in-time manufacturing. Companies around the world adopted variations of his tracking system, often without knowing its wartime origins. The true measure of Hoffman's impact, however, cannot be found in military doctrine or business practices. It lies instead in the thousands of soldiers who survived the war because they were properly fed and equipped, men who returned home to raise families, build careers, and contribute to their communities, never knowing that their lives had been saved not by a battlefield miracle, but by an accountant's attention to detail. In the final analysis, Walter Hoffman's story reminds us that heroism takes many forms. For every famous general or celebrated combat veteran, there are countless individuals whose vital contributions remain hidden from public view. The security of nations and the lives of those who defend them often depend not on dramatic gestures or inspiring speeches, but on the quiet competence of those who ensure that the fundamental necessities of war and peace are properly provided. Hoffman's ridiculous chart, once mocked by those who couldn't see its significance, ultimately saved more lives than many of the celebrated battles that dominate our historical memory. It stands as a testament to the power of expertise, the importance of speaking truth to power, and the incalculable value of doing ordinary work with extraordinary care. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.